All right, welcome back, guys. This is part 2 of our Everything You Need to Know About Growing Tomatoes from Seed video series. And just to recap, part 1, you learned why you want to start it from seed versus being lazy and just buying it from the nursery. I pass no judgment, but, and we also talk about how you actually get the seeds to germinate on a professional level. So if you watched that video and you followed all those steps, chances are by now you have little baby starts in your greenhouse or in your garden that are ready to go to the next step. So I'm going to talk about what that looks like. But before I do that, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button so you're notified anytime we put out a video. So I'm going to show you a couple different ages of plants, if you will. So you can see, let's see, where's the little baby sprout? Where'd it go? Did I cover it? Oh no, here's one right here. So here's a baby sprout. And let's see, I planted these on the 6th of February, and it's Valentine's Day. So we're talking that was about, I don't know, give or take 10 days, more or less. Seeds, really good quality seeds, tomato seeds, should germinate really under 2 weeks if they're in good conditions. And what do I mean by good conditions? Meaning that it's warm enough. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, they all like to germinate in warm soil. So if you're starting seeds in zone 8, 7, 6, you might have to give some supplemental heat to make that happen. Here in zone 10, it was 90 degrees last week, not a problem. The soil is going to be warm enough. The colder the soil, the slower the germination on your tomato seeds and the more erratic. You'll notice like, oh, half the tray germinated, the other half didn't. That is temperature related. You plant your seeds, they should germinate more or less a week, at most 2 weeks. Then you get them to about this form, or this size rather, this age. And this is a good looking tomato because it's 1 per cell, okay? If you seed your tray too heavily and you have tons of plants, you'll notice that they're much more stunted. And I'm going to show you a real life example of what that looks like here in a second. But so these guys have grown, and this is a beautiful little tiny baby tomato plant. It's got its first set of leaves, which are these ones right here, the cotyledons. Then you have your first set of true leaves. And what does that mean? Those are the leaves on a plant that actually look like the plant that you're going to grow. These little first ones, they just look like long leaves and they could be confused with anything. But these, you know that's a tomato leaf. At this stage is when you are going to want to fertilize. That's because a seed, as you hold it in your hand, it's a living, respiring organism. And it has enough energy to do one thing and one thing only: break through the soil and find sunlight so that it can photosynthesize. In a normal situation, like in nature, the seed would fall into the ground, there would be nutrients in the ground, so it would photosynthesize from the sun and get energy that way, and it would also pull energy from the soil. Well, seed starting mix tends to have no fertilizer or very little amounts of fertilizer. And so we want to feed these guys regularly with a diluted amount of organic liquid fertilizer so that they grow very quickly and they get up to looking like this. And you want to do that when they have their first set of true leaves. Now, we like to use an organic fish emulsion, and that's because it doesn't burn the plants. It can actually be sucked up by the leaves as well as the soil, and so you can be a little more forgiving with it. It's inexpensive. We can find it certified organic. So there's just reasons why that's the product that we use. You guys can use any liquid fertilizer that is very low in its numbers. And let's think about why that is. You wouldn't give a baby a steak, right? Okay. You want to give a baby formula or milk, and it's usually somewhat diluted. Baby plants are just like that. They can't take on a lot of nutrients all at once. And if you use a chemical liquid fertilizer, it's likely to burn the plants, and they will actually, you'll just see fertilizer burn, they'll all fall over, they'll look terrible. Another reason why we like using something low in its numbers and its nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, like fish emulsion. And it's a little stinky, we don't care on our farm, not a big deal, but if you're doing it maybe indoors, you might want to try a different product. At this point, I'm going to fertilize. This guy hasn't been fertilized yet, and if I were to just leave him to grow in this pot, totally without any supplemental nutrients, it would really lag behind these guys, which look huge and incredible. So fertilizing is key. The other part of it is potting up. So these guys here were actually started in tiny little 6-packs by a friend of mine, and he gave them to me, and I immediately potted them up into their own little pots here. Now look how incredible that is. This already has roots coming through. And I potted these up, let's see, I potted these up on the 5th of February. So in, 9 days, basically, they've already grown to the point where their roots are coming out of this tiny little pot. That should really hammer home to you that tomatoes grow very quickly and they need as much soil as possible to get really big and happy.
Can you say that that's not a tomato just because you'll get comments about it? Is that a tomato?
This is a tomato. What are you talking about? Yes, it's a potato leaf tomato. My videographer just was like, that's not a tomato. Like, I don't know what a tomato is. Of course this is a tomato. It's a potato leafed tomato, which is really hard to say. But this is like Brandywine. Their leaves look different. And not to make fun of my videographer, there is a difference. There is a obvious difference in those leaves, but they're both tomatoes. Just so you know. So the nice thing about tomatoes, and one of the reasons why they're so easy to grow, is they can grow almost hydroponically. And what that means is, as long as their bottom roots have access to oxygenate, that's a hard word to say.
Who's making fun of who now?
As long as the roots have access to water that has oxygen in it, meaning not stagnant water, they'll continue to grow because these roots can suck up moisture and nutrients from that water. Now, at this point, if you're a gardener, especially if you're a first-time gardener and you see the roots coming through here, if you have the time and the capability, pot them up for 2 reasons. 1, the plant will continue to grow at an exceptional rate if it has undisturbed soil that it can move its roots into. 2, you don't want it to become root-bound. A root-bound plant will grow very slowly compared to a plant that can just grow, without any obstruction whatsoever. The other thing is, so 3 technically, is you don't want your pots to fill up with so much roots that they really quickly and easily dry out. Especially if you're a brand new gardener, you want to give yourself as much room for error as possible. This tiny little pot is going to dry out a lot quicker than a big pot like this. So that's something to keep in mind. The less soil you have in a pot, the quicker it will grow out, and the more likely you might come out and have a oh shoot moment of, I forgot to water, everything's dead. So let's avoid that. Pot it up. Now, what does potting up look like? It's pretty simple. It's the process of going from one size to a next size up. I recycle a lot of pots on the farm just because I hate plastic waste, and there's a lot of plastic waste in agriculture in general. So I've got these little plastic pots here, and I'm gonna fill these up with recycled potting soil. I'm not gonna fill this up with my high quality, very expensive seed starting mix. Why? Because the seed starting mix is for one thing and one thing only on our farm. It's to get the seeds to germinate. Once these little guys have popped through the soil, I don't wanna waste that very expensive, high quality product on, growing tomatoes when tomatoes can grow in anything. So typically what we do, I have soil that has been recycled, so it's pots of stuff that maybe didn't germinate, basically any little pot that doesn't actually make it out into the garden gets thrown in here, and then I'm going to use that to fill this guy up. Now I know what a lot of people are thinking. Well, if you do that, you're inviting pathogens into your seed starting mix or your greenhouse. Yes, that's totally true. Because this is recycled soil and it's been moist, it's likely to be teeming with all kinds of bacteria, fungus. Sometimes I'll come out here and I'll dig in here and I'll actually see at the bottom there's some like white mycelium, so basically mushrooms starting to grow. And I'm okay with that because this plant, this size, should be strong enough and healthy enough to outgrow any pathogen that is in here. And if it's not going in my catalog, it's not growing on my farm, it doesn't have good genetics, I don't care about it. So it's a way in which I can really push the seedlings for disease resistance and just vigor in general. So I'll take a bigger pot And use anything you have. I mean, you really don't have to go out and buy special pots. This is just a recycled pot from a agave that I bought at some point. So I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna pot it up. These are really nice because they have the little 4 circles at the bottom that allow you to really get the seedling out. And this is a good stage to transplant because the roots are not totally wrapped around this pot, around this soil. If they become too root bound and you go to stick it in another pot, you really have to break those roots up for the plant to know what to do. Otherwise, you stick this in this pot and it stays the same size the whole time because it really has no idea that it's in a bigger pot. This is a perfect stage because these roots can continue to grow and thrive. Pretty simple because it's good quality soil. So simple. Now, for tomatoes, I'm gonna take these bottom leaves off and I'm gonna add a little more soil around here. And all of you should know why I'm doing this. It's because the tiny little hairs on the side of your tomato plant are roots. If you bury them, you will have even more roots growing in your pot. So you can bury tomatoes very deeply. So that's potting up. And you can do potting up from this size. You know, you can see here that I've been recycling all kinds of pots. I've got this size here, all the way down, you know, to these pots here. The point is you just want to give them more soil to expand their roots in. Now, before I go on, I'm going to show you a perfect example of what happens if you don't thin and you don't pot up your plants. Okay, so these guys were planted on the 8th, and that's all these guys here. They've been potted up. Look how big they are, okay? They were planted, thinned, and potted up. Whoa. Over here, these guys also planted on the 8th, not potted up. Look at that. And that's because they're struggling and fighting with each other. Problem number 1, there's 1, 2, 3 tomatoes in this tiny little pot. Problem number 2, I didn't pot them up into something bigger. And you can see the ones that look really bad. Look how many tomatoes are in there. That's way too many tomatoes in one tiny little pot. And if I pull these out, you can see they're just fighting with each other. So these all need to get separated one by one and potted up in its own pot. And tomatoes are very forgiving. You can just pull it off. This needs to be planted all by itself in its own pot so that it can thrive. As long as it stays together in this tiny little pot, it's not going to look like these guys. So there's a prime example of what not to do. I'm going to pot these up. Why haven't I done it? Time. I just haven't gotten to these guys yet, but I will, and then they will look like these guys. So it's a really important thing to remember. Give your tomatoes ample space to grow, fertilize them often, and then you will get them up to this beautiful size so that they need to go outside. Now, before we get to part 3, I'm gonna show you what your tomato plant should look like before you transplant it outside. So this guy, big, beautiful, healthy, and here's a key factor here. Look, it already has the beginnings of flowers. So I don't want to keep it in my greenhouse much longer. Now, I started these as early as December because we're in zone 10 and we can do that. For those of you that are in 8, 7, 6, so on, you probably don't have tomatoes this size and you can't transplant them outside yet because it's still way too cold. Here in San Diego, we can. And the cues to me are, A, it's getting too big for this pot, okay? It's starting to get root bound. You're seeing the roots are starting to really curl around each other. So that's, you know, that should be signal number 1. Number 2 is it's even like too big for the pot and that it's gonna start falling over. And you can see some of these over here. This guy needs to go in the ground. He's too big, he can't hold himself up. The amount of plant matter on top is way too much compared to how much soil it has on the bottom. So that's another reason. Also, as I mentioned, the flowers, they're starting to flower, so I want to get them outside. So I have all these amazing tomatoes that are ready to go. So let's go into part 3 and I'm going to show you how you transplant them for success.